The big question right now is, can the Federal Reserve do anything to help with the current economic situation? In this video, I want to give you some of the principles that I have distilled after teaching thousands of college students about the Federal Reserve and what the Fed does when it works, and the situations where the Fed is powerless, or at least the times when the Fed faces a pretty big trade-off in what it wants to do. The Fed kind of feels like a superhero that we call when the economy is in distress. But when are the times when we really want to call it? Well, I'm reminded of a time when I'm on the freeway in my Jeep. My mom's in the passenger seat. I'm bringing her back to the airport. We've just had a few kids, and she is imparting some stories about my childhood that I did not even know. The kind of stories about raising children and the kind of choices that parents have to make. And something she says reminds me of what a Federal Reserve chair said, of all things, right? Like, that's what moms usually do. They usually remind you of the Federal Reserve, right? One of the first economists that I can remember, he didn't teach me, but I think this was, back in the day before Facebook and we were sharing memes and stuff, there were email chains that would go around, and I got this email chain from someone, and it was Alan Greenspan talking about how he liked to forecast recessions. And he said, like, the thing that you look at is not, GDP. It's not what's going on in factories. If you really want to get ahead of a recession, what you need to look at is underwear sales. Because when people think that something's bad's going to happen, that's the first thing they cut, because no one can tell what you're wearing underneath your clothes. And so they will cut their expenditures there before they cut them anywhere else. And in this car, my mom's talking about the times when we were in financial difficulties because my father was in the real estate industry, which goes up and down with the economy. And so there were times when we were down and she had to make choices. And she said that there were times when she looked at her clothes and realized she should probably buy some new ones. But she knew that buying new clothes for her meant she couldn't buy new clothes for us. And so she would often go longer without buying new clothes to make sure that her kids could have the clothes. Now, this is a situation that we typically think about when we want the Federal Reserve to come in, because this is when a recession is happening on account of what we call a demand shock. People are worried about the future, or something has happened where they are starting to reduce their expenditures. And because they reduce their expenditures, the economy all of a sudden gets out of whack, because stores make decisions based on their projections of your behavior, of my behavior, right? Like, when a restaurant opens up, it has an expectation of how many customers it's going to serve. Things are going along and things are booming. They realize, like, hey, this is really good. Maybe we need to expand. Maybe we need to put out that stuff on the patio, right? Go buy some of those space heaters, right? The lantern ones that come in and feel really nice when you're sitting right underneath them. Actually, probably too hot, get a little farther out and they're worthless, right? But there's that zone. And so they start buying those kind of things to expand the restaurant, or they get more cooks, whatever it is. And then if you're cutting back on your clothing expenditures, you're probably also cutting back on your restaurant expenditures. And now this restaurant that made decisions based on what it thought the world was going to be like now has like some serious difficulties because people aren't showing up at their restaurant anymore. This is when people are cutting their demand. And there's a couple of reasons why. One of the most popular ones, is popular the right word to use here? One of the most common ones is probably a better word to use, is when people are facing uncertainty. They think something is going to happen in the future, and so they start preparing for it now. They start cutting that underwear purchase now because they don't want to get into the future and realize they don't have enough money to meet that crazy situation. So if things are falling like that, well, the Federal Reserve comes in, and what the Federal Reserve can do through the money supply is help bolster those expenditures. It can help make money available, right? And maybe I personally am not spending as much money, but again, it's the businesses. It's the restaurants. It's the retail stores. It's the home builders, right? All these different businesses, they're making decisions about the future. And if things all of a sudden change, they might need access to money to help them get through those hard times. And if they don't get that access, then the economy really gets hurt. So the Federal Reserve makes this money available to the economy. There's more cash flowing around. And as a result, hey, look, the economy is doing better, right? Superman has swooped down and lifted the economy up. And you can see, like, you have lived through some of these things. If you go back to March 2020, when the pandemic has first hit, and people are really worried about what's going on in the future, there are two organizations that act before anybody else. One was the Federal Reserve, right? Congress wasn't doing anything. The White House wasn't doing anything, but the Federal Reserve stepped up and they did something. The other was the NBA. But let's focus on what the Federal Reserve did. The Federal Reserve stood up and said, like, hey, we're going to provide liquidity. We're going to do whatever we can. We want to try and reduce as much uncertainty as possible to help you get through what's coming up over the next couple of months or years, right? The Federal Reserve, they jump in when there's uncertainty, when there's a drop in national expenditures. Their job is to help push that up. That's going to help growth continue on as normal. And sometimes there's a little bit of inflation that comes on, but if things are already dropping and the Fed is fighting back, that helps counteract that inflation. So that is a time when the Federal Reserve, what they're doing is what we call for. It's when it's necessary. It's when it helps. But like Superman, there's also a kryptonite. When the Federal Reserve feels weak, when the Federal Reserve can't do anything, or at least, like I said, it makes a trade-off. I like to think about what happened in the 1930s, right? In the 1930s, you have the Great Depression. You have a lot of these things where, like, the Federal Reserve could have been helping, but actually the Federal Reserve made things worse. But also during the 30s, there was this crazy agricultural disaster, right? Where people are out farming and then all of a sudden they realize that rich soil they have is being carried away and they're being left with a beach, a nutrient desert, because all of the good topsoil has been carried away by the wind. You probably know this as the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was this huge shock to the economy where our agriculture all of a sudden just couldn't produce what it could in the past. That nutrient-rich soil had been taken away. Other people are getting it, and it's not helping because it's been, changed into dust over the Great Plains. So it's not actually settling down and helping you with growing things in the east. And we have this issue where our productivity for our agriculture just drops like crazy. The places that normally produce corn or wheat, they can't produce it anymore. Maybe there are some places that can still eke something out, but they're not places that you naturally go, or they can't keep up with the loss that we had, right? So this is something that we call a real shock, or a shock to the real economy, or a productivity shock. This is something that affects the way we produce in the country. And when we get a real shock like this, that is something that the Federal Reserve has a really hard time fighting, right? Like, again, let's go back to COVID. The Federal Reserve can come in and help with uncertainty. They can help bolster confidence. They can make money available to you if your business is struggling. But what's the Fed going to do against a virus, a pandemic? Well, the Federal Reserve can only help so much. And the things that were happening with the pandemic, like people staying indoors or supply chains getting backed up, the Federal Reserve can't do much with that. So let's think about, we're in 2025. Trump has been in the presidency for a little bit. What are the kind of economic issues that are coming into play, and what can the Federal Reserve do? Well, one thing is policy is just changing just every day, back and forth. Nobody knows what to expect with the Trump administration right now. And so that uncertainty is leading a lot of people to wonder whether they should be buying those things they have right now, or if they're going to lose their job, if the economy is going to tank, whatever it is, if they need to hold back. That is a situation where the Federal Reserve could come in and help, because the Federal Reserve, that's what it's designed for. But think about like other things happening. We have just one of the largest increases in tariffs in American history. We are looking at other countries and saying, hey, we used to have manufacturing in this country. Now it's got this tariff. We need to start looking at somewhere else where we can source our goods. Sometimes that's America, sometimes that's another country. But that's like the Dust Bowl hitting the whole world, because there are some places that grow phones or clothes as if they were wheat. And now these tariffs are descending on these areas, making them nutrient deserts, right? Where they can't produce these things because nobody wants to buy that stuff that's now super expensive. But the reason why we buy it from them is because they're better at making that stuff than other places, right? We're already going to the places that do a great job, just like we grow corn and wheat in places that are really good for growing corn and wheat. You're not growing it in the American South. I mean, maybe you're growing some, but like the places that are the most productive, you grow it there. And then like if you're growing in the South, that's like trying to do, shirts or smartphones in the United States. Yeah, we can do it. You're just not going to get as much out of it. And it's going to be really expensive when you do it. So when the Federal Reserve tries to come in and counter one of these, then we're facing trade-offs. Because when things get scarce, so think about the agriculture during the Dust Bowl. Now we don't have as much wheat. We don't have as much corn. Well, when things are scarce, the prices are going to go up. And if the prices go up, well, then when the Federal Reserve comes in and says like, oh, we're going to help this by putting more money into the economy, but we don't have as much stuff in the economy, well, that's going to force the prices to go up even more. Now, you might get a little bit of economic growth out of it because they've helped get the economy running again. So you might be able to offset a little bit of that shock to growth. But the trade-off is you're going to get much higher inflation. And that can be crippling to the economy. Well, what if the Fed does the opposite, right? They know that inflation is coming because prices have gone up. Well, maybe they decide to take money out of the system to try and bring inflation down. That's what they normally do when we're having inflation. You got to bring the money out. Well, now that there's not as much money circulating in the economy, sure, prices go down, but then economic growth just gets much worse because people can't go out and buy things. That's the trade-off that the Federal Reserve faces when they're looking at a productivity shock, a real shock. All they can do is either help economic growth at the cost of inflation, or they can help inflation at the cost of economic growth. They can't have it both ways. So when you're looking at the current situation, you have to ask yourself, is this a demand shock? Federal Reserve, great place to look. Or is it a productivity shock? The Federal Reserve, they're not going to be able to do much. But you can do a lot. One thing you can do is subscribe to this channel. Also, YouTube thinks that you're going to be really interested in watching this video, so click on that one too.